Berlin, November 1st, 1923. A man sits down and orders 2 beers. He insists on paying for both of them immediately, even the one he hasn't touched yet. When the waiter asks why, the man doesn't smile. He simply says, because by the time I finish the first one, the price of the second will have doubled. This is not a joke. It is the precise moment a monetary system died. Not because of the math, but because the belief evaporated. We often look back at these events, ancient Rome, revolutionary France, or the Weimar Republic, as tragic accidents committed by people less sophisticated than us. We assume our modern central banks have solved these problems. But financial collapse is not an accident. It is a recurring architectural feature of fiat systems. And if you look closely at the money in your pocket right now, you won't just see a medium of exchange. You will see that the exact same historical blueprint is being executed again, only this time with digital efficiency. This is not a history lesson. It is a forecast. To understand the present, we must first look at the wreckage of the past. Pick up a Roman denarius minted under the reign of Augustus. It feels heavy in your hand. It shines. It contains nearly 95% pure silver. This wasn't just a coin. It was a contract, a physical promise that the empire's value was as solid as the metal itself. But running the world is expensive. Legions need to be paid. Bureaucracies expand like a gas to fill the available space. The emperors face the eternal dilemma of every politician. How do you pay for things you cannot afford without raising taxes? You dare not collect. They chose the path of least resistance. They chose the silent tax. They called in the silver coins, melted them down, mixed in base metals like copper or bronze, and reminted them. The face on the coin remained the same. The legal value remained the same. But the soul of the currency was being surgically removed. It was a slow bleed, almost imperceptible at first. The ancient version of the boiling frog. By the time Emperor Gallienus took the throne in the 3rd century, that once proud silver coin had been reduced to a pathetic 5% purity. Eventually it became nothing more than a bronze slug with a thin silver wash, a counterfeit issued by the state itself. The Roman state operated on a delusion that modern central bankers still cherish the belief that value can be dictated by decree. They believed that if the emperor said a piece of bronze was worth a day's labor, the market would obey. But governments always overestimate the power of their edicts and underestimate the intelligence of the local butcher. The market reacted the only way it knows how, with brutal honesty. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded. Merchants hoarded goods. Trade routes that had stood for centuries disintegrated into inefficient local barter. But the fatal blow wasn't economic, it was military. Mercenaries do not bleed for bronze. When the legions realized they were being paid in worthless tokens, their loyalty didn't vanish. It was simply auctioned to the highest bidder. Rome didn't fall because it ran out of steel. It fell because it ran out of silver. We look back at these shaved coins and see a primitive scam. We tell ourselves we are too sophisticated for such crude theft. Yet every year, your central bank explicitly targets a 2% reduction in your purchasing power. They don't clip the edges of your coins anymore. They don't need to. They simply print the value away from the inside out. But if you think a coin made of nothing is dangerous, wait until you see what happens when money becomes a promise backed by land that doesn't exist. Move forward to the late 18th century. If Rome was a slow bleed, the French Revolution was a lesson in the illusion of safety. When the revolutionaries took power in 1789, they faced a bankrupt nation. Their solution was arguably more sophisticated than many modern crypto projects. They didn't just print paper, they issued the assignat. This wasn't fiat money. It was a mortgage on the nation itself, explicitly backed by the most valuable asset in France, the confiscated lands of the church. They called it the national domains. The pitch was seductive. This piece of paper represents soil, they said. Land cannot be printed, therefore this money cannot lose value. It is the same logic used today by every asset-backed stablecoin or real estate token. It appeals to a very specific dangerous instinct, the belief that if an asset is tangible, the currency linked to it is immune to politics. But politics is a solvent that dissolves even the strongest contracts. By 1792, France was at war. The government needed money, and they had run out of church land to seize. A disciplined banker would have stopped printing. A politician facing a hungry army does not stop. They made a quiet, fatal decision. They stopped burning the notes as the land was sold, as they had promised. Then they started printing notes backed by land that had already been sold. The market is not sentimental. It is mathematical. The public realized there were now 2 claims for every acre, then 3, then 10. The backed currency began to freefall. The government's response was not to stop printing, but to criminalize the math. They passed the law of the maximum, setting price controls on grain. Then came the terror. They decreed the death penalty for anyone who refused to accept the assignment at face value. Think about that. A government so desperate to maintain the illusion of value that it threatened to separate your head from your body if you preferred gold to their paper. Yet despite the guillotine, the bread disappeared from the shelves. Farmers looked at the paper, then at their wheat, and decided the wheat had a better future. The guillotine is a terrifying instrument, but it cannot bake bread. The French experiment proves a chilling rule. An asset-backed currency is only as solid as the discipline of the issuer, and when the issuer has a monopoly on force, Discipline is the first thing to be devalued. But at least the French had land. What happens when a government decides it doesn't need assets at all? What happens when the only backing for the currency is the speed of the printing press, and a war that cannot be won? Let's return to that beer in Berlin. Between 1914 and 1923, the exchange rate of the German mark against the US dollar didn't just move, it evaporated. It went from 4.2 marks to the dollar to 4.2 trillion. That is not inflation. That is the mathematical definition of infinity. But to understand how a civilized nation drives its currency into the abyss, you have to ignore the wheelbarrows of cash and look at the ledger. Germany had financed the First World War entirely on credit. They didn't tax their citizens. They borrowed from them, betting that victory would pay the bill. When they lost, they were left with a mountain of debt and a bill for reparations demanded in gold. The government faced a choice: default on their own people, or destroy the currency. Like almost every government in history, they chose the printer. The fatal break happened in January 1923, when French troops occupied the industrial Ruhr Valley to demand missed payments. The German government ordered workers to strike. They called it passive resistance, but those workers still needed to eat. So the government did something that broke the fundamental law of economics. They printed money to pay wages to people for not working. Money is supposed to be a store of value representing labor. In Weimar Germany, it became a receipt for idleness. The velocity of money accelerated until it broke the sound barrier. A pound of bread cost 3 billion marks. A pound of meat, 36 billion. Men would rush to the factory gates when they were paid, throwing bundles of cash to their wives, who would run, literally run, to the nearest shop, because prices would rise before they could cross the street. This was not just an economic crisis, it was a moral inversion. The class that suffered the most was not the poor who had nothing to lose, nor the ultra-rich who held factories in foreign currency. It was the middle class, the doctor, the teacher, the veteran who had dutifully bought government bonds. A lifetime of savings enough to retire in comfort was reduced to the price of a single newspaper. Meanwhile, the debtors were liberated. If you owed 1,000,000 marks on your mortgage, you could now pay it off with a single banknote found in the gutter. The system punished prudence and rewarded recklessness. It taught an entire generation that saving is for fools and debt is for kings. This absolute destruction of the middle class did something else. It created a vacuum of authority. When money dies, society looks for a savior, and it rarely cares about the savior's resume. It is no coincidence that amidst this chaos, fringe radicals began to find an audience. Adolf Hitler wrote extensively about the humiliation of German debt in Mein Kampf. The hyperinflation didn't just bankrupt the country, it radicalized it. It proved that when a government breaks the trust in its money, it isn't long before the people break the government. Weimar shows us that money is not just a medium of exchange, it is a social contract. And when that contract is torn up, the demons of history crawl out from the shredder. But why did people keep using the mark for so long? Why did they hold on to it until it was literally worthless? The answer lies in the strange psychology of the trust horizon. Money is not a tool of mathematics, it is a tool of theology. It requires a metaphysical belief that a piece of paper, or a digital entry, has value simply because a group of men in a boardroom say it does. When that belief holds, commerce flows. When it breaks, no amount of police power can force a farmer to trade his wheat for a promise. In every historical collapse, there is a consistent pattern of denial from the top. When the denarius turned to bronze, or the assignat collapsed, the authorities never admitted they had debased the currency. Instead, they found a scapegoat. In Rome, they blamed hoarders. In France, they blamed counter-revolutionaries. In Weimar, they blamed foreign speculators and the Jewish population. The government always frames inflation as a crime committed against the state, rather than a policy enacted by the state. They tell you that rising prices are caused by greedy corporations or supply chain disruptions. They will never tell you that rising prices are simply the currency collapsing against the real world. But the most dangerous moment is not when the printing starts. It is when the trust horizon recedes. For years, a population will tolerate slow inflation. They grumble, but they adapt. They believe the government will eventually fix it. The tipping point, the moment a currency truly dies, arrives when the collective consciousness shifts. It is the specific second when the public realizes that the government cannot stop printing. They realize that inflation is not a temporary emergency measure. It is the only structural pillar keeping the state from bankruptcy. When people understand that the inflation is not a bug, but a feature, the velocity of money explodes. You stop holding cash for next week, you spend it today. You buy anything. Land, gold, cigarettes, whiskey, anything that cannot be printed by a bureaucrat. So why do we wait so long to panic? Because cognitive dissonance is a powerful drug. To admit the money is broken is to admit that your savings, your pension, and your social standing are illusions. Most people would rather cling to a comfortable lie than face a terrifying mathematical truth. We continue to use the dying currency not because we trust it, but because we are terrified of the alternative. History tells us this psychological break is inevitable. But in the past, information traveled at the speed of a horse or a newspaper. The trust horizon could take decades to vanish. Today, information travels at the speed of light. And now, take the leather wallet out of your pocket and look at the glowing rectangle in your hand. We are replicating this exact psychological cycle, but we have upgraded the transmission speed from the printing press to the fiber optic cable. And in a world of high-frequency trading, the time between loss of faith and total collapse is no longer measured in years. It is measured in milliseconds. We told ourselves we were building a new world. We said code is law. We believed that by moving our assets onto a blockchain, we were escaping the debasement of Rome, the politics of France, and the printers of Weimar. But if you strip away the sleek user interfaces and the futuristic terminology, you realize we didn't build a new system. We accidentally rebuilt the American Wild West banking system of the 1850s, put it on a blockchain, and called it progress. Look closely at the foundation of this new economy, the stablecoin. The stablecoin. It is the lifeblood of DeFi, yet it is structurally identical to the French assignat. It is a private currency issued by a centralized entity that promises, "Trust us, we have the dollars in the vault to back this up." Do they? Just like the French revolutionaries who printed more notes than they had land, modern issuers face the eternal temptation to print more tokens than they have cash. The audit is always coming soon. The reserves are always commercial secrets. We traded the opacity of the Federal Reserve for the opacity of a shell company in the Caribbean. And then there is the architecture of the market itself. The Bank for International Settlements calls it the decentralization illusion. Illusion. They are not wrong. We claim these protocols are run by the community. But when a hack occurs, or when a stablecoin depegs, who makes the decisions? It is never the community. It is a small group of developers and whales holding governance tokens. That is not a decentralized democracy. That is a centralized oligarchy with a Discord server. This ecosystem thrives on leverage. We created platforms where you can borrow against volatile assets to buy more volatile assets, creating a spiral of debt that masquerades as wealth. When the market goes up, we call it yield farming and financial innovation. When the market goes down, we discover it was just leverage. The liquidity that seems so deep on the screen evaporates the moment you actually need it. In traditional finance, when a bank run happens, the central bank steps in as the lender of last resort. In DeFi, there is no lender of last resort. There is only the algorithm, executing liquidations with the cold indifference of a guillotine. We thought we were building an alternative to the system. Instead, we built a chaotic, high-speed testing ground for the tools that will eventually enslave us. Because the chaos of the Wild West is exactly what the Empire needs. It provides the perfect justification for the sheriff to ride into town. And the sheriff isn't bringing Bitcoin. He is bringing something far more powerful and far more terrifying. While you were distracted by the volatility of Bitcoin charts, the empires were quietly laying new tracks. Today, 134 countries, representing 98% of global GDP, are actively building a digital successor to the cash in your wallet. It is called a central bank digital currency, or CBDC, but do not mistake this for cryptocurrency. Bitcoin was designed as an exit from the system. A CBDC is a high-speed entry into its ultimate version. It is not an asset you own. It is a direct liability of the central bank. If crypto is the Wild West, then a CBDC is the arrival of the Federal Railroad, efficient, unyielding, and completely controlled. The sales pitch focuses on convenience. They tell us that money will flow like electricity, enabling real-time, seamless payments across borders without the friction of traditional banks. And it's true, the system will be remarkably efficient. But in the world of finance, efficiency for the user is often a byproduct of total visibility for the issuer. The true power of a CBDC lies in its programmability. Unlike a physical dollar bill, which is indifferent to how you spend it, a digital dollar can be programmed with conditions. It can have an expiration date to stimulate the economy. It can be restricted to certain geographic zones or specific types of goods. If the Roman emperors could have programmed their bronze coins to vanish if they weren't spent on grain, they would never have needed to clip the edges. A CBDC also provides a definitive solution to the bank run problem, the ghost that has haunted finance since Rome. In a crisis, you cannot withdraw your digital assets if the system simply disables the transfer button. It creates a closed-loop economy where your wealth is a permissioned entry on a government ledger. We are moving toward a reality where computerizing old paper processes is replaced by a total digitization of the monetary soul. It is the dream of every failed empire in history, a currency that is impossible to hoard, impossible to hide, and impossible to exit. The trap is not being built with bars and locks, it is being built with fiber optics and convenience. We are approaching a convergence point where the debt of the past meets the technology of the future, and in this new architecture, the question isn't whether the system will survive, it's whether your financial sovereignty will. Look at the calendar. We are currently standing at a unique intersection of history and technology. The long-term debt cycle is reaching its mathematical conclusion. Across the globe, sovereign debt has reached levels so astronomical that they can never be repaid in currency, with today's purchasing power. History tells us there are only two exits from this room: a massive default that destroys the banking system, or a controlled debasement that destroys the value of the money. Every empire we have discussed today eventually chose to devalue, but in 2026, the mechanics of that devaluation have been upgraded. In the 1920s, a collapsing system looked like a man with a wheelbarrow full of paper marks. It was visible, chaotic, and impossible to ignore. In the coming era, The collapse will be silent, sterile, and fully digitized. Instead of the uncontrolled panic of the Weimar streets, we are moving toward a managed inflation orchestrated through central bank digital currencies. The CBDC provides the state with a scalpel, where it used to use a sledgehammer. If the government needs to devalue the currency by 10% to wash away its debt, it no longer needs to wait for the market to react. It can simply adjust the digital ledger. It can implement negative interest rates, effectively charging you a fee for the crime of holding on to your own labor. You will not see the collapse on the 7 o'clock news. There will be no images of burning banks or rioting crowds. You will open your phone and your digital wallet will still show the same balance you had yesterday. But when you go to pay for gas or groceries or rent, you will find that those numbers buy slightly less than they did 24 hours ago. And because the system is a closed loop, you will have no unstructured way to complain. The Roman citizen saw his silver turn to bronze. The French citizen saw his land-backed notes turn to ash. You are watching your sovereignty turn into a line of code that requires permission to execute. We have reached the point where the trust horizon is no longer a distance we look toward. It is a wall we are about to hit. History provides a brutal, recurring lesson. Every paper currency eventually returns to its intrinsic value, zero. Rome attempted to outrun this truth. Revolutionary France attempted to mask it. Weimar Germany attempted to ignore it. Now the digital world is attempting to automate it. The only variable this time is the exit. In 1923, you could still buy gold or flee to the countryside with coins sewn into your coat. But in a world of CBDCs and total digital oversight, there is no back door. The trap is not made of bars, but of fiber optics and convenience. The question is no longer whether the system will reset. The mathematics of debt made that inevitable years ago. The real question is, when the silence of the digital collapse begins, will you be the owner of real assets, or just a tenant of numbers permitted on someone else's screen? If you want to decode the rules of the game before the board is cleared, leave a 1 in the comments and subscribe to Financial Money History. We will continue to follow the paper trail, wherever it leads, because ignorance is the only tax that eventually costs you everything.